Hi, my name's Robert Penner, and today me and the fine folks at Radiant Press in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, are celebrating the launch of our new book, Strange Labor. The cover is by my friend Paul Clausen. Thank you for coming to help celebrate this occasion with us. The story itself is about a future in which the vast majority of humanity has left the cities and towns to build these massive, monumental, mysterious earthworks. It's told from the perspective of the small fragment of the population that is not participating in these events and does not understand why they're happening. I'm going to read two passages from the book. The first is the description of the main character scavenging for pharmaceuticals in a deserted town. I hope it's more interesting than I just made it sound. And the second is the effort of her friend Dave to try and make sense of the strange circumstances in which they find themselves. Between these two readings, I'm going to have a conversation with David Bergen about the book. The second afternoon she was there, Esther sent Miranda down into town with the red sled to scavenge for bullets and pharmaceuticals. For trade, she said. There's a Mennonite who comes around in the spring with a wagon. After that, Miranda went every third or fourth afternoon. Sometimes she took Arthur along, bundled up, bony nose protruding from scarves, heavy mitts duct-taped on. "Marigold," he would holler through his muffler. "Marigold." Occasionally he would fall off the sled, and Miranda would pile him back on. Sometimes he would make a break for it, and Miranda would gently corral him, let him vent for a few minutes, and then get him settled down. Sometimes he would start to weep, and Miranda would turn around and pull him home before she set out again. But mostly he was content, if they were busy and didn't stay too long in one place. It was good work, walking those quiet, orderly streets with Arthur in tow. In each house, Miranda would let him wander about the living rooms and kitchens while she raided medicine cabinets, pantries, bedrooms, sheds, and basements. Esther had given her a list of medications to look for: antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-inflammatories, Enbrel for arthritis, memantine for Alzheimer's, opioids, amphetamines, pseudoephedrine. In the evenings, after the old folks were put to bed, Esther would sort through the take. Most of the Enbrel and the memantine she would assign to the locked pantry in the visitors' lounge, along with assorted anti-inflammatories if they were running low. She would pick over the antipsychotics thoroughly, looking for clozapine, which she would keep for herself. Miranda would store the rest in the basement. With the accumulating ammunition, the linen, toilet paper, paper towels, the hams, the potatoes, the rows and rows and rows of canned goods that made Miranda think of Andy Warhol and latchkey lunches when she was a kid. Miranda and Arthur were in a big house on the hill, filled with high-end furniture and electronics. The ensuite bathroom held a cornucopia of antidepressants. After she filled up her backpack, Miranda went through the walk-in closet. The clothes were beautiful, many clearly bought in the city, or perhaps even abroad. They were all a few sizes too small for Miranda, but she looked through them anyway, testing the fabrics between her thumb and forefinger, sometimes rubbing them against her cheeks. A red silk dress was slung over a chair in the corner. When Miranda picked it up and held it to her face, she was convinced she could detect the faintest hint of a rich floral musk. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, and the room spun slowly around her. The house spun. The whole world spun, and she could hear the clink of ice in lowballs and the echo of laid-back jazz and a woman's throaty laugh on the other side of a door. On the way home she shot a couple of rabbits. Arthur held them on his lap, rubbing the fur this way and that, staring into their blank eyes, singing softly to himself. A few days later, they were working a more modest street that ran across the hill below the house with the red silk dress. In a run-down bungalow Miranda had just finished looting, she found Arthur in the kitchen, inconsolable. He was holding a photograph tightly in his crooked fingers. He'd plucked it from the fridge. A strong-jawed, middle-aged woman in a pantsuit stood in a park or a garden. Her salt and pepper hair was cut sensibly short. She smiled for the camera. "Is that Marigold, Arthur?" Miranda asked, but he just sobbed. "Does she look like Marigold?" He refused to put it aside for his mitts, so she let him hold it in his bare hands all the way back home. Esther was irritated. "He could have gotten frostbite," she said when she examined his raw red hands. "Again." "I didn't have the heart to take it away," said Miranda. "It might have been someone he knew." Esther rolled her eyes. "He's got a whole shoebox of middle-aged women under his bed," she said. "Not one of them looks like the other, yet he has wept like a big baby over each and every one." Miranda shrugged. Still, she said, I didn't want to ruin his moment.
That was Robert Penner reading from his novel Strange Labor, published by Radiant Press. My name is David Bergen, and I'm a Canadian novelist who has the pleasure of speaking with Rob, whom I've known from the past and recently made contact with, and around this novel, which I found to be quite an incredible piece of writing, and I quite loved it, and it should be read. And Rob and I are going to be in conversation here about the book, and I'm going to be sort of asking questions, and hopefully it'll become a conversation about writing, about labor, about storytelling, characters, and I'm also curious about genre. But let's begin with my first question. And years ago, Rob, when you were still living in Winnipeg, you asked me if I had read Dusklands by J.M. Coetzee. And I hadn't, and then I did. I don't know if you recall that. And the story itself is about dominion and caring for the sick, and it's about revenge. And some of your themes in this novel, Strange Labor. And here's my question to you, a very simple one to ask, but perhaps are harder to respond to. What informed your story, your novel, Strange Labor?
Well, it's the Coetzee's kind of. It's funny that you bring it up because I was just thinking of the life and times of Michael Kay.
Yeah.
And it was a book I'd been thinking of before I started, and so ostensibly it's a post-apocalyptic novel. But one of the things I was interested in is sort of the unimportance of the word post in those sorts of situations. And so the life and times of Michael Kay is more or less about a young man in what seems in some ways to be a post-apocalyptic situation, but in another sense is just life.
Right.
So I think that was one of the main ideas that informed it, was how do you write about post-apocalyptic situations when you don't really believe in post-apocalyptic situations, when you think a post-apocalyptic situation is always somewhere else, and even in the midst of catastrophe, it's just life as it always was. So the Coetzee shout out is intriguing because I was thinking about it just before I started writing, and then again I was actually thinking about it this week. I was thinking about that novel.
Yeah. And the life and times of Michael Kay is probably more appropriate in its comparison to your novel, in the sense that it's in Coetzee's case, it's a man wandering with, I believe he has a shopping cart, or he's wandering through a bleak world, and your character, a female, Miranda, who is, I think, really brilliantly drawn, is in a similar situation. And I want to ask you this. Early in the novel, Miranda describes the movement of the people away from their lives. They walk, they don't talk, and they're pulled by some force, whether it's interior or exterior, and it feels magnetic. It's a drawing of millions of people from their regular lives. And not to read too much into it, and you don't give the reader much more than that, this sense of walking away from what is their regular life, in quotation marks. But there was a sense of the mindlessness and of the unthinking masses who will become what you call diggers. And yet you don't judge them. They are nonviolent, extremely passive, and the followers who don't know what they are following. And I guess you can address anything I've said just now, but are we all mostly followers, do you think?
I mean, I think a lot of it, I have a PhD in history, in British imperial history. And one of the tensions when you're working with historical material is this tension between these big social histories where you're looking at movements and trying to understand sort of the lived experience of individuals. And I think that tension, that analytic tension between a very wide scale in which the individual sort of vanishes, and the very small scale psychological or existential analysis that I'm interested in with Miranda, is a tension that I'm not interested in resolving it, but I am interested in playing with it. And sort of when you do look at the masses, there's always this temptation to think of them as mindless, and I think that's the eye of the beholder. Uh, and the silence, in some ways, was I just didn't want to deal with it because I wasn't actually interested in their interiority. What I was interested in was this Miranda's and other characters' sort of absolute inability to get inside what
Yeah.
was happening.
Yeah. Yeah. At one point, and it's a great scene, she meets up with a guy called Dave, and they meet up with a group of men who are sitting by a campfire, and these men hold up the trucks and the diggers, and they either shoot them, they throw them out of the trucks, they take what they have. The diggers don't respond; they're very passive. But in a conversation around the campfire while they're drinking and smoking up, Miranda is aware of the 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 lack of, well, she's bored by the conversation. So in some ways, these men around the fire who think themselves to be better than the diggers, because at some point a character called Smacksburg says they're just dumb animals. They're sheep. I don't know. You use a number of adjectives to describe, or nouns to describe these diggers, and and at one point, and I think he's right. Smacksburg said, or someone says, logistics. These people don't know logistics. And then Smacksburg said, ants do. And I thought that was good, because ants is often it's an insect we look at as being useless, and yet they outnumber us. They are incredibly productive, and so in some ways the diggers are like ants.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a I guess the other thing that's interesting about that is this idea of intelligence, about trying to understand an intelligence that isn't the same as our intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah.
This absolute sort of mutual incomprehensibility, that you simply cannot understand what's motivating or what's driving or what's shaping the behavior of not just the diggers, but I think for Miranda, she lives in a slightly solipsistic universe, and a lot of time there's just an inability to even understand basic human behavior around her, to try and think through, well, what's motivating that person to do this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like initially when I was first thinking about it, I'm not even sure what my idea was, but very quickly it was this idea of intelligence in some way, and cognition being incommensurable, or in you just simply can't understand what's happening
I
across.
think, yeah, and you do catch that this sort of misapprehension of the other.
Yes.
Yeah, which is how we live today, and how we've probably always lived, and we think we know the other, even the person sitting across the table from us eating grapefruit, and yet there's always a misapprehension, and you've upped the ante, and you've put Miranda, who's trying to understand, and the good thing about Miranda is that she knows she doesn't understand.
Uh-huh.
Whereas Smacksburg or even Dave haven't reached that level of cognition yet.
Yeah, that willingness to fail, right?
Yeah.
To reach out and just fall short, and like that was, to me, the most important thing about Miranda, was just simply that sort of self-containment,
Yeah.
that awareness that, okay, I
Yeah.
understand, but that's
Why a woman? You must maybe she came to you fully created when you started the novel, but did you start with a woman as your main character?
I did. I
Uh-huh.
did. It was initially a short story, that began very, very late in the narrative. So I would say three-quarters of the book are, at least, are sort of backstory.
Yeah.
So it actually began with her and Dave out in the West.
Okay.
And why a woman? I don't know. I think at the time what I was really interested in was the contrast between her and Dave.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And Dave is a great character. He and Miranda play off each other very perfectly. He has some fine speeches, and on one on page 69 about words and talking and thinking. He's a bit of a philosopher, and I wondered how much fun you had writing him. It feels like it must have been fun.
It was the easiest part of the book because he's probably I identify quite strongly with Dave in terms of those sort of those beat explosions of language.
Yeah.
When I first started writing, that was how I wrote, was the way Dave talks. And so to dial it back to Miranda's precision and restraint was actually very difficult
Yeah,
for me
yeah,
personally.
yeah.
Whenever I was writing
Yeah,
Dave, I was relaxed, totally relaxed.
yeah, and you can feel that. Although the contrast is great, and you don't want all of Dave. In fact, Miranda holds the center of the story. Dave is too far. He zigzags all over the place, and so and Miranda holds him in place in many ways. And we won't give anything away about the end, but they have a relationship that I thought you developed really well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised by it. I mean, I had a lot of conversations with my partner Nicole actually about it because she doesn't care for Dave and she really likes Miranda. So one of the things I was doing when I was extending it and writing it was trying to show her that Dave's actually okay, that
Yeah.
he's not just this voice that's trying to impose itself.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
actually something else going on there.
Yeah, and you there is a tension. You don't know what's going to happen in their relationship. You don't know if Dave is a violent man. You don't know, and that group of men, you don't know what's going to happen. And there was a sense, I felt fear for her,
Uh-huh.
um, and the way I felt fear sometimes for, let's say, Cormac McCarthy's characters, that she was heading naively into a strange world, and her choices would get her in trouble. And yet, you don't show violence in the same way, let's say, that Cormac McCarthy does. And I'm using McCarthy deliberately because, of course, you have a section in the novel called "The Road,"
Uh-huh.
and whether it's elusive or not, I don't know. But I think that you pull back from the violence. You there's a fine line that you walk between the possibility of violence and the quiet acceptance of the characters, especially, well, then the diggers who are not violent at all. But yeah, I did feel fear for
And
Miranda.
that was a goal. But the one thing, I would say, if there is a critique in the book about the general post-apocalyptic form, it's about that violence. And again, historically speaking, most of the time humanity's been on the planet, it hasn't been a particularly violent situation. It's just small groups of people occasionally interacting, and there's this idea that if civilization collapses, everything will end in an ocean of blood. And there's actually no real reason to think that over an extended period of time things will be that violent. There's always the potential, and there
Yeah.
is violence, but it's for most humans it's actually something that happens somewhere else.
Mhm.
Even in a war or a civil war, the violence for most people is peripheral to their existence, and things just keep
Mhm.
happening. So it's there, and people are aware of it, and it creates fear and anxiety.
You
But
you hope it doesn't arrive.
that's
Yeah.
right. You
Yeah.
hope it doesn't arrive.
Now Miranda does, or maybe it's Dave in their van. He has a 45, a gun.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's his. I can't remember if it's his or hers. It's it's his.
It's it's hers actually. The
It's
she
hers.
starts off with a 45,
Okay.
and the only time she uses it is to scare off dogs.
Yes.
Um,
So she does use it. So you
yeah,
do have the gun go off in the
yeah,
third.
yeah. In the third act, actually, it's the first act. I didn't
I
notice.
know. I know.
Wait,
I was referring to Chekhov's
yeah,
idea of the gun. If there's a gun in the room, it has to go off.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. It doesn't have to necessarily kill anybody. Yeah.
No, but
Yeah.
it was discharge.
Yeah. Yeah. And that. Yeah. Um, labor. This,
Uh-huh.
this idea of labor, spelt with a U, of course, because we're
Yeah.
Canadian. Have you worked as a ditch digger? Have
As
you
a
worked with
ditch
your
digger,
hands, Rob?
I have worked with my hands.
Yeah.
Not a great deal, but I have, and I do actually. I was just talking to Nicole about the therapeutic worth of digging holes, just randomly digging
Yeah.
holes in a
Yeah.
backyard. The hardest I've ever worked was on a chicken farm. which is a different kind of shoveling, but it's still shoveling.
Yeah, yeah. The idea of a shovel that they and this is very far out somewhere else, but Seamus Heaney has a poem called "Digging,"
Uh-huh.
and he talks about his father digging potatoes, and then by the end of the poem, uh, you realize that he uses the term his pen is digging. You
Uh-huh.
know, he digs with words, and his father dug with a spade. But I was curious about this idea of labor, and then I I'm not sure I still understand. I mean, the title itself, "Strange Labor," and I
Uh-huh.
was really aware as I was reading the book. It made no sense to me why these diggers, why these huge machines were digging furrows in the earth, to what end? And
Uh-huh.
to myself, and you don't have to say to what end. That's neither here nor there. But it was is labor necessary in our lives? Like, do we need love and work, like Freud says? And does Miranda have that, or do the diggers have that? Do they have love?
Uh-huh.
Schnackberg says they don't have sex. Does he know?
Uh-huh.
Did you know?
Do I know? I have theories, but
Yeah,
I'm just Dave, right? Like I have theories. I didn't want to think it through too much. It was just, I mean, my whole life's been a working life until COVID. But I mean, labor, it's always strange, and particularly in a capitalist or a post-capitalist society when you don't even know why you're working anymore. And when when something like COVID happens and everyone suddenly stops working and nothing that dramatic changes, they've just stopped working and their lives change with it. It doesn't feel as dramatic as it should to stop working. So it does bring the question of why and
it
what
also makes yeah,
work, especially
also
what sort of work.
makes you question why you're working in the first place
Yeah.
yeah. There was an article I read recently about a transit driver, a bus driver in New York, during the time of COVID, and it reminded me a little bit of what you were doing too. Is he absolutely believed in his job. He believed that he was front line. He was rescuing people. He was putting himself in danger.
Mhm.
Wasn't allowed to wear a mask at first, and yet he saw his job as a bus driver, ferrying people here and there, back and forth, as being one of the most important jobs possible,
Uh-huh.
which I thought was. I mean, his colleagues are dying, but he went out every day and he worked. He got spat on, he got called racist names, but he in that sense, his sense of labor was very important to him. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
I think it's Bertrand Russell defines labor as just simply moving one thing across the face of the planet to another place. Just moving things back and forth. We've added digging, so you're also moving things up and down. But
yeah,
in a sense, that's all it is. Is it's people moving shit around,
yeah,
or
yeah,
um, and the importance of it. I don't know. I mean, in this case, I think I buy that guy's argument that what he's doing is
yeah,
true.
yeah, yeah. I know you grew up with a biblical background,
Uh-huh.
uh, and whether it was secular biblical background, but I know you have a knowledge of the Bible. And I wondered at times if you weren't playing with the New Testament teaching that the meek shall inherit the earth. In your book, that would be quite literally for the meek. The diggers do inherit the earth, and they dig
Uh-huh.
the earth, right? So you're playing. It seemed to me that you were. That may have been subconscious. I don't
It
know.
was, but it's there. One of my blurb writers pointed it out and it was the first time I really thought about it. That they did inherit the
Yeah,
Earth, but they are the ones that get the planet.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
what
yeah,
happens after that? I mean, it's a short inheritance, I should
yeah,
think, but
yeah.
still, yeah.
I think I say in my blurb that I wrote for you that I love the last line of the novel, and it sort of came out of nowhere. I didn't it for what seems to be a fairly dark story, and it ends with a tremendous amount of hope,
Uh-huh.
uh, because we're in Miranda's head, so what's amazing to me is that you managed to convey that hope through her vision. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, did that ending come to you before you finished the novel? Did you know where you were going?
Oh, I knew exactly where I was going because it had been a short story, and the ending in the short story is the same
Uh,
in the novel. So, in a sense, it was very easy because I knew that that was where it was going to stop. So, I
so
could have backed up to any point in history, and I would have ended up in
exactly.
exactly the same point. So, it threw a light, I think, back through the text for me, which is a massive advantage that no one else
Oh,
would have
it's
had.
amazing.
But
It's amazing to it's like you going on a road trip and you know exactly where you're headed. You
yeah,
know what's going to happen along the way, but and structurally, it's probably a much more efficient way to write a novel.
but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, this is your first novel, yeah?
Uh,
Or have you written
yes.
others under a pseudonym or?
Well, there's a self-published one under a pseudonym called "Let the Bastards Burn" under William Squirrel, but it's a very, very different sort of a book. I would say this is my first novel.
Yeah,
It was
and you've
much more
written and
experimental.
you've published and written short stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
number. Genre, almost all genre. A couple you might call literary.
Okay, so that's that. I want to maybe at the end, just as we come to the end here, I want to ask you about genre because I'm skeptical of genre. I'm
Uh-huh.
skeptical of that word because I think it narrows things down so that the reader thinks, okay, I'm heading. So if you read Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, you think you're heading into a crime novel, and yet you're not really. You're heading into a pretty literary novel that has
Mhm.
that has some great escapades in it and psychological uh, depth. Or if you read Ursula K. Le Guin, you might see her as a science fiction writer. But I don't. So when you say genre,
Uh-huh.
uh, would you call this novel a genre novel? Like and if you do call it a genre, what do you mean by that?
I guess it's a marketing move more than anything else, right?
Yeah.
So when you say genre, there's certain expectations that the reader is going to have of the text. I always feel a little constrained by such readers, not by the readers, by the definition.
Yeah.
The readers are what they will. I don't. When I write, I very rarely think I'm going to write a genre piece. I just write the story. For me, genre, especially science fiction, is a title pool, and so it's a place where you can safely experiment um, with ideas in a specific way, with a like that very if X then Y will happen. So in that sense, Strange Labor is a genre novel because I'm saying if in this situation, how would people react and what would they do? And that's to me, that's the core of science fiction is you have this basic idea, usually a scientific idea, which it is not in my case. And then you say, what happens if this happens? And then you explore that.
Mhm.
And so for the people that are very committed to the genre, that needs to be the very center of the book. And for the people on the fringe, that doesn't need to be the case. And
No.
and for people outside of it, it sometimes gets in the way of the read. This intellectually sort of self-aware idea of this concept, but it's also a tidal pool in the sense that I mean the waves come and go. You don't have to stay in the tidal pool.
Yeah.
You can, if you wish, for your whole um, lifespan as a shrimp or whatever, or you can go out into the ocean. So
Yeah.
I think of genre as a safe place to explore. I think
Yeah.
that's what really provides people.
Yeah.
Um,
Because when I read this, using my sort of template for genre and not necessarily and being skeptical, I thought this is just a great novel.
uh,
It's just a good story, and we always, even literary novelists, set up a if this then what
right.
not, and so there's always for me, if a story is going to work, you have the character, and this is a character driven novel, really. is what the stuff that happens peripherally to Miranda is out there, but she's observing it, and we are psychologically inside her head and emotionally with her. And so literary novels do that all the time, and it just happens to be that this could be called futuristic science fiction,
Right.
And I would hate for people to not pick up this book because it was considered to be a genre novel. I have nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that. But I would love for other readers to pick up the book and discover
I
this.
would too, because I think it does speak to a wider audience
Yeah, yeah,
than
yeah.
gear.
And tell your publisher to submit this for prizes.
I will. Hopefully,
That,
hopefully they're listening.
um, one last thing. It seems that the novel is an exploration for how we might live. One character says about drifters, a poorly lived life and a lonely death. Which characters live examined lives in this novel, if any? And also, there's a philosophical bent to the novel, which I really liked. It doesn't come through the narrator, it comes through the characters talking, through the voices. And that's tough to do without sounding pretentious. Were you aware of how you were managing this?
Yeah, yeah. At a personal level, the struggle with pretension has been long and difficult. So I'm always aware of it when I'm writing. I think Miranda lives a well-examined life. I think she's a fair model. Some of the other people too. There's a couple of minor characters that I think are dealing with reality in a psychologically pragmatic way. Uh, in the author's photograph, I'm wearing a North Carolina Panthers cap.
Okay.
And I'm not a big fan of the Panthers, but I was down there, so I had the cap. And when one of my friends saw it on Facebook, he said I was going to get excited about it until I saw the hat, because it's a Panthers hat. And I said, well, it's a novel, it's a narrative. I can't remember exactly, but I think I basically said it's a bleak narrative about how to live without hope.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm wearing this particular hat, or something to that effect. And I think there's this idea, I think, in the novel that you don't need hope to live well,
Yeah.
which sounds much bleaker than I
Yeah.
think it actually is. I don't think it's that bleak a statement. And I think the novel, in a lot of ways, is exploring how do people in these really bleak situations continue to persist, and not just persist, but to live with pleasure.
Yes, and I imagine that those people might have a definition of hope that's different than ours or yours.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting statement. Yeah,
But it's not the persistence, right? It's like, I mean, things persist, people persist.
yeah, they do. But
It's
the question is, why? Why do these diggers persist? Why does Miranda persist? No family. Uh, she's isolated, and she has Dave, but he too is isolated. Everybody they meet is isolated. The children are feral. And yet, contrary to what you say, there's hope in that last line. Yeah. At least for me, my sense of what hope is. But I love the darkness. I think there's nothing better than something that's incredibly dark. That's for whatever reason gives you hope. Yeah, and I think you do that with this novel. Yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Rob.
you too.
You have anything else you want to add? And any I've missed, I'm sure, lots, but it's a start.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy with that conversation.
Yeah. This whole time we've been talking, I've got a fireplace beside me with a door on it, and there's a bird inside there trying to get out. And so that bird has hope that it will escape at some point. So Rob, great to talk to you. And for those who are listening, Rob's going to read some more from his novel.
Miranda's vision inspired Dave to start spinning stories about what he called their post-apocalyptic situation. He didn't call them stories. He would wink at Miranda when she called them lies. Dave preferred the term proofs, because he imagined himself in an argument with Miranda about how radical the break between the present and the past was. It was an impressive catalog of human types he had invented, and he would run through it while Miranda drove. Well, he cooked them their suppers, while they shared a drink and a toke in the evening. Skulls on steaks and Caucasian dudes with beards cutting themselves up with razor blades before they went to war with each other. Terrorists and prophets and troubadours. Refugee encampments. Convoys of cheerful, daydreaming enthusiasts driving up to Canada the Great White Hope, where they said there was still electricity, plumbing, vaccinations, pension plans, universities, and science. So much science. Science growing in the fields and raining from the skies. An endless harvest of science. Little clusters of true-believing pessimists killing time until the big finish. Deliberate junkies methodically looting the pharmacies. Angry, patriotic dads with assault rifles and RVs and water-purifying systems, trying to keep their depressed pill-popping wives and illiterate pyromaniac children in line with Bible verses and ritual promises and the constant, rumbling, subliminal threat of their suicide murder Abraham begat Isaac prayer noise. Bandit chuffers, survival heads, hippie dirtbags, glory singers, Nazi baby farmers, zucchini planters, murder Christians, might as well be Christians, love Christians, happy Christians, suburban get-alongers, philosophical nihilists, practical nihilists, schmilist nihilists, dog walkers, nature zealots, sewer troglodytes, hospital zombies, color purple homesteaders, weed people, poppy people, meth people, shazbots, scarecrows, acid splashers, good cannibals, bad cannibals, cannibals, and on and on and on he went, populating the whole empty span of his imaginary post-America. But she remained unconvinced, so one day, while he was stewing some rhubarb he had harvested from the corner of a farmhouse, he told her about these guys called the White Wolves. Bikers from the South, from Louisiana, from East Texas, who came up north every summer, looting the petty bourgeois settlements and the condominium fortresses and the gated Jerusalems alike. They had long beards, eyes like weeping sores, yellow teeth. They burned it all down, like what happened in Cleveland with those assholes, with those Nazi assholes in Cleveland. They burned the few remaining stands of civility and decorum to the ground. And in the winter they would head south into Mexico, and in the summer come ranging up the Mississippi, up over the Appalachians, to cut the ears off people for their Mardi Gras necklaces and fly bloody scalps from aerials on the back of their bikes. He met this guy they'd attacked. They'd run him off the road, shattered his window, and reached in to get at his ears and his hair. Then they left him strapped into the car and roared away. When he healed up, the guy looked like a peeled grapefruit. Like a peeled grapefruit, Dave repeated. In Indiana, Dave said he'd come across a kumbaya camp they'd raided. Mostly just bits and pieces left, but a couple of mangled women still alive. Moaning, Dave said. They were moaning. He told her these stories and more, so many more, but she was bored. She felt like she'd heard them all before. She was drinking a Chateau Pononsac, which Dave found in an unexpected small-town wine store and insisted was top-shelf big city swill. She drank it straight from the bottle and finished a joint while she stared out across the empty fields of weeds and saplings where wheat and canola and flax once grew. All she could think of while he tried to horrify her was how good a crumble would be on that rhubarb, and some ice cream. But when Dave finally paused and stared at her, eyebrows raised as they were whenever he felt he'd won an argument or at least scored some points, she felt like she should respond. "Well, Dave," she said, "there's nothing post-apocalyptic about violent men getting what they want."